It's kind of like an epic, like I feel like we're going to start a movie or something. That's good because we are starting an epic sermon series. We are starting 4 weeks studying one of the most famous humans in all of history. And I'm not going to pretend like you don't know who it is because the name's on the screen behind me. We are studying, it was a surprise to you, huh, Dan? We are studying David. We're going to do this for 4 weeks. I get to speak with you for 2 weeks. Then Rob's going to be speaking the last 2 weeks of these series. So I'm excited to be here. If you don't know who I am, my name's Josh, and I happen to be one of the pastors here. I also used to lead Sanctuary for about 10 years before Rob, and then he came and made it way better than I did. So I'm excited to be here and speaking and kicking off this series on David. Now, David is, like I said, one of the most famous people in all of history. He's one of the most famous people in the Bible. In fact, David is the second most mentioned person in the Bible. Do you know who the first most mentioned person in the Bible is? It's Jesus. Good job, Dan. You got that one good. So Jesus is number one, but if you're number two and Jesus is number one, you're doing pretty good. All right, so David is the second most mentioned person in the Bible. David is this amazing Renaissance man. David is an absolutely fierce warrior. Now, before David became king, he was one of the military leaders for Israel, which was kind of the country he was a part of, the group of people he was a part of, the Israelites. And he was a military leader for them, and they actually made up a song about him and the king. The king at the time was a guy named Saul, and they made up this song. And the song said that Saul had killed thousands of people, but David had killed tens of thousands of people. That's what they said. This guy killed tens of thousands of people. Not only that, when he was a kid, like 10 or so, he killed a bear and a lion. Okay, so this guy was just this amazing warrior. But in addition to that, he was also a poet, a songwriter, and a musician. It says in the Bible that he played an instrument called a lyre, which is like a mini harp. Okay, I don't know how many warriors you know that play mini harps, but I don't know that many. I mean, this guy was just amazing. Not only that, the book of Psalms is the longest book in the entire Bible, and it's a collection of his poems and songs. That's what the book of Psalms is in the Bible. This guy was, again, fierce warrior, but also amazing musician and songwriter. In addition to that, he's known as being sort of a nice guy and a really good friend. I mean, there's a really touching story in the Bible about him and his best friend named Jonathan and how they supported each other and encouraged each other. And so, warrior, musician, friend, and if that wasn't good enough, it literally says more than once in the Bible that he was good looking. I kid you not. It says that this guy David was good looking. Now, I have to admit, as I thought about studying David, I began to feel a little insecure. I mean, this guy is look at who this guy is. I mean, I can't play any musical instrument. You want to keep me away from anything musical. I can barely change my own tire in my car. I've never killed a bear or a man, or, maybe that's a good thing. But, I was like, oh, man, I don't know if I can talk about this guy. And then I began to study him in a little bit. And the good news was, as I began to study David, I realized that what made him be the great man that we know was actually not what I thought. And in addition to that, the way kind of God saw him and the reason God used him was actually very different than what I thought. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to look at a couple stories in David's life. And I want to look at just how he became who he was. So we're going to look at some stories from the early on in his life that kind of give us an insight into who was this guy. How did this guy become what we know as King David? Now, I have to admit to you, we don't have time to read all the passages. So I'm going to skip some verses and kind of explain a little bit what's going on from time to time. But here's what I really want to encourage you. Throughout this whole 4-week series, here's what I really want to encourage you. I really want to encourage you when you get home or tomorrow or the next day, dust off your Bible, pull out your phone, and look up 1 Samuel. All right, 1 Samuel, we're going to start in chapter 16. Start in chapter 16 and start reading about this guy David, because I got to skip some stuff that's some good stuff. In fact, we actually got a study guide. There's a little resource center out there, and I spoke this morning, and we sold out of our study guides. But you can sign up, and there'll be one next week if you want a study guide that kind of studies 1 and 2 Samuel that actually helps you understand a little bit about who David is. All right. So here's what we're gonna do. All right, we're gonna jump in. Looking a little bit at a couple stories of the life of David. It's going to start 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1 says this. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will be king." Let me just explain a little bit what's going on here, who some of the characters are. We haven't got to David yet, but we got some characters here. So this passage starts out, and the first character we run into is named the Lord. That means like God created the universe. You should know who that one is, all right? So first it starts off with the Lord, and then the second person in this story is somebody named Samuel. Now, Samuel was the head priest of all of Israel, which is like a group of people, kind of like a country. So he was the head priest. He was the head religious leader for this whole group of people, this whole country. He was really well known. People knew who he was. Probably the best way for us to think about a little bit about what he might have been is to think about the Pope. If you think about the Pope, like when the Pope goes somewhere, it makes the news. He goes somewhere and everyone knows, hey, the Pope is here. You know, and he's kind of a big deal. You think about that when you think of Samuel. And so here's what's happening in this story. So a few years back, the people of Israel, they were getting beat up by the countries around them. They were fighting them and they were beating them. And they decided, hey, we need a king. We need a king. All the other countries seem to have a king. We need a king that can bring all of our army together and go fight against these other guys that are beating up on us. And so they decided to pick a king. And they picked the guy who was the biggest guy in all of Israel, a guy named Saul. It says in the Bible he was a head taller than everyone else. Now, I like tall people for obvious reasons. I'm decently tall, But Saul was not a good tall guy, all right? Saul was not a good tall guy, ended up not being a very good king. He didn't follow God very well. People didn't really like it. He took money from them. He took their taxes. And so Saul ended up being not a great king. Samuel wasn't happy. God wasn't happy. The Israelites weren't happy. And so basically God says to Samuel, hey, why don't you go anoint the next king? We realize Saul's not a good guy. Let's go pick the next king. He says to Samuel, go to Jesse's house. One of his sons is going to be the next king. Now, here's the problem. Here's what Samuel says. Samuel goes, I can't do that. If I go, everyone knows who I am. If I go and say, hey, here's the next king, Saul's going to kill me. Saul doesn't want there to be a next king. Saul wants to be the king. So here's what happens in the next few verses. We're going to I'll explain what happens. We'll skip over those. So what happens in the next few verses is God actually says to Samuel, okay, that makes sense. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go to Bethlehem where Jesse lives, and you're going to sacrifice. That's something you would normally do. That's kind of a religious function you would do. You're going to go there. Everyone's going to just think, okay, the priest is here doing his thing. You're going to make a sacrifice. Then you're going to go to Jesse's house and pick one of his sons to be king. Samuel says, okay, I think I can do that. So let's pick up the story. Samuel gets to Jesse's house. Let's see what happens. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. Okay? Here's the story. Samuel goes there. God's going to help him pick out which one. The first guy walks by. It seems like it's his oldest son. Looks like a big, strapping guy. Looks like he could be a good king. Samuel thinks, hey, this is the one. God says, no. None of these 7. They find out there's one more. The youngest son, probably around 10 years old. Maybe around 10 years old. He's out watching the sheep. Jesse, the dad, didn't even think it was important enough to have him be there, that he was even there. But Samuel says, go get him, bring him in. Let's see what happens. So Samuel sent for the son tending sheep and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. I told you. They said he was good looking. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. Okay? Here's what happens. Little David comes in. Samuel says, boom, this is the one. So he anoints him, said this is going to be king. Now, my big question in this whole story, why in the world did God pick David? I mean, there were thousands of people he could pick from, all over. There's even 8 sons. Why did he pick David? Why this person? And another interesting question is, why did he do it now? We know from later on that actually David didn't become king till he was 30, so almost 20 years later. Why did he pick this guy? Well, we do get a clue. There was a verse that we read that gave us a clue about why. This is what God told Samuel in verse 7. It says, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." That was the older one. The Lord looks at the things the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Why did God choose David? Because of his heart. There was something about David's heart that was different than everybody else, that was different from all the brothers. Now, we don't really know what it is. At this point, they don't tell us what it is. They just said, hey, David had a different heart. David didn't look like a king. He didn't have the education of a king. He wasn't old enough to be a king, but he had something in his heart that separated him from everybody else. And so my big question then I go is, well, what in the world was it? What was it in David's heart that made him different from everyone else that God said, I'm going to pick this kid? Well, to answer that question, we've got to go look at another story in David's life. And this happens a few years later. Because do you know what happened after David was anointed? So Samuel comes and says to David, hey, you're going to be king. Says it in front of all his brothers and his dad. I'm the youngest. I have 2 older brothers. If somebody would have come and said I was going to be king, I would have held it over my brothers. I'd be like, guys, king here. Just, you may be older, but I'm the king. All right? Now, you know what's interesting? You know what David did right after he got anointed? He went back to the sheep. In fact, we don't get the impression that they told anyone, and probably for good reason. If they told people, hey, this is going to be the next king, he might have been killed. But we know he went back to watching sheep because the next thing that happens in the Bible is that he gets called in from watching sheep to play some music for the king. And then, after he plays that music for the king, he goes back to watching sheep because in the story we're going to read, he gets called in for watching sheep. So for the next few years, he's just been anointed, you're going to be king, and he goes back to watching sheep. And now, something interesting happens where we get an indication of what it was in his heart that's different from anyone else. So let's look at the next story. We pick this story up in 1 Samuel 17, verse 1 says this. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another with a valley in between. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. I don't know, are you guys up on your pounds to shekels weight ratios? You got that? Okay, so here's what happens. So here's what's happening in this story. All right, so there was a group, like kind of the neighboring country, it was the Philistines. They decided they wanted to fight the Israelites. So they got their whole army and they put them on a hill. We're going to say that hill is over here. And the Israelites got their army together and they're on a hill over here and there's a valley in the middle. And the Philistines, they got this big guy named Goliath, like this giant of a guy. He is somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. There's actually controversy over how tall he was, if you want to go study that if you'd like to. He was somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. The armor he's wearing, the bronze armor, weighs over 80 pounds. He has this spear, and the end of the spear, which is like the pointy part, this pointy part on his spear weighs like 20 pounds. So you imagine this like giant dude throwing a spear at you that weighs 20 pounds. Like that's going to pierce through any of your armor. That's not going to be good, all right? So we have this guy named Goliath. Now I thought that you guys might need some help envisioning what Goliath looks like. So I had one of the artistic guys at the church here, I had him build a Goliath for me. He's right over here. You thought I was lying. All right, here we go. We got Goliath right here, all right? All right. His head looks kind of small, doesn't it? I've thought that all day. But anyway, We got Goliath here, all right? So this is Goliath, this big giant of a guy, okay? Now let's see what happens next in this story, okay? Let's follow along here as we go to verse 9. It says this: Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Okay? So you got the scene here. You got the Philistine army over here on the hill. You got the Israelite army over here on the hill. And twice a day, morning and night, this guy Goliath, this big giant, comes out. And he actually makes a pretty reasonable request. He says, rather than having both our armies fight, you pick your strongest guy. I'm our strongest guy. If I win, we win. If he wins, you win. But nobody from Israel will fight him. Like, this guy is just massive. Like, nobody will fight him. And so for 40 days, this happens. Well, now, what about David? I'm glad you asked. All right, let's figure out, how does David factor into this story? Let's keep going with the story, all right? Verse 17 says this: Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of the shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse directed. All right? So here, what's David doing during all this? Watching sheep. He's watching sheep. Why? This is he's maybe like 15 years old, 14 years old at the time. He's still watching sheep. Now, his older brothers, they're in the army. So Jesse's dad says to David, "Hey, why don't you take some food to your brothers? Take some bread, take some cheese, go to your brothers, see how they're doing, and come back." All right, now, I thought you might need a little visual of what this looks like. So Ian, why don't you come on up? This is Ian. Give Ian a hand here. Ian is my son. Ian, how old are you? 14. Ian is 14 years old, right about the age that David would have been. So when you think of who was gonna come out and fight, I need you to think of like a 14-year-old kid like this. But there's one thing you need, Ian, just for accuracy here. All right, we've got a little charcuterie platter of cheeses here for you, because you know what it said in the story, that David brought cheese and bread. Like, he came out with some cheese and bread and came out to the battlefield. It looks like this. Now, there's only one problem with Ian here. Ian is way too tall. There is no way David at 14-year-old was 5'9" like Ian. Because basically, the average man at that time was probably only about 5 feet tall. So Ivy, all right, Ian, give Ivy the cheese. This is Ivy here. Ivy, why don't you come up here? We need to switch out kids here for a second, because Ian is he's the right age, but way too tall. Thank you, Ian. So this is Ivy. How tall are you, Ivy? You're 5 foot exactly, right at 5 foot. David was probably, at most 5 feet tall. All right? So the reason, because you need this visual, all right? Because this is what happens. This is the size of the person bringing cheese to his brothers, all right? That is what David was. That is who brought cheese to the battlefield that day. You got that in your head here? All right. Ivy, you can sit down. You can take the cheese with you. Don't let Ian eat any. Now, so this is what happens. David comes out on the battlefield, and when he arrives, he actually hears Goliath come out. Goliath comes out, gives his challenge, said, "Who's going to fight me?" David, as a 14-year-old, 5-foot kid carrying cheese, hears this. He hears this challenge from David, and he hears this challenge from Goliath, and he thinks, you know what? Maybe I could fight him. Maybe I could. And Saul, the king, hears that David says he's going to fight him, so he comes, and Saul goes, "David, you're way too little. Like, you're just a little kid. How are you going to fight Goliath?" And he said, "Okay, if you think you are, maybe you could try to wear my armor." So he tries to put on the king's armor. It just doesn't fit him because he's a little kid. So he says, "You know what? I got my slingshot. I think I'm okay." So David, this little kid, walks out on the battlefield and attempts to fight Goliath. What in the world enables a kid with cheese to fight Goliath? What is going on in his mind, in his heart? What is it about him that gives him that confidence and boldness to go say, you know what, after I have my appetizer, I'm going to go fight a giant? What? Well, to understand that, we need to look at what happens when David walks out on that battlefield. David walks out of the battlefield, and Goliath literally laughs at him. Like, literally laughs at him. Like, why are you coming out to fight me? You're just a little kid. And David, this little kid who just handed off his cheese, says this to Goliath. Let's read 1 Samuel 17, verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." What in the world enables a kid carrying cheese to go up to a giant, point at him and say, "I'm going to cut off your head and feed your carcass to the birds"? What is it? It's his heart. There's something different in David's heart than anyone else. There's thousands of Israelite warriors on this hill who won't do that. And a teenage kid carrying cheese says, "I'll do it. I'll cut off your head and feed you to the birds." That boldness, that confidence that David had. When I see that, I go, man, I could use a little of that. I mean, there's a lot of times where I get up in the morning and it's kind of like, oh, all right, another day. I got to do this, and I got to do this, and I got to do this, and I kind of stressed out because I got to talk to this person. I don't want to talk to this person. I don't want to see that person. And oh man, it's not going to be good today. How do I get up in the morning and go, all right, day, I'm going to cut off your head and feed your body to the birds? How do we do that? Well, the good news is these verses, they give us some indication as to why. What was it about David's heart that was different from anyone else's? What was it about David that was different? Here's a couple of things that David did. David trusted God, not his own appearance or his abilities. Right? He trusted God, not his own ability. By his own abilities, there's no way the little kid with cheese was going to beat the Goliath. I mean, it wasn't going to happen. He wasn't big enough. He wasn't strong enough. He didn't have the skills on his own. David, when he fights his battle, he doesn't go up to Goliath and say, "I'm going to beat you because I'm better than you." Not only that, he doesn't actually say, "I'm going to beat you and everyone's going to remember who I am." He went up and he said, "I'm coming in the name of the Lord Almighty." Like, God is bigger than I am. Most of us, we get up every morning and we go through life and we spend a lot of time thinking about all the reasons why we can't do stuff, why we're not smart enough or big enough. We don't have the time, we don't have the money, we don't have the background, we can't do it. So I do want to ask you a question. How much time do you spend thinking about what you can't do rather than what God can do? How much time do you spend thinking about, by your own abilities, what you can't do, what you don't have the ability to do, the skills to do, rather than what God, who created the entire universe, can do? Because the truth is, if we put kind of the pressure on ourselves, if it's all about our own abilities, we're going to be insecure and frustrated. Because we're not good enough. I mean, even if you're really good, Even if you're really skilled. If you say, it's all on me, I have to do this, you're going to be stressed out. You're going to be insecure. You're going to be frustrated. What if you say, all right, you know what? I know that God is with me. I know that God is next to me. I know that God is here. That's what begins to lift the pressure off our shoulders. That's what gives us that confidence and the boldness that David had. The other thing that David did, it kind of goes hand in hand with the first one, is David remembered who God is and what God promises. He remembered who God is. If you read through the Psalms, which I would also highly encourage you to do, if you read through the Psalms, those are basically David's kind of writing poetry about his life. And if you read through those, you'll notice that David's life was not easy. There were many times, not just like once, there were many times where people were chasing him and literally trying to kill him. I'm not talking about figuratively. I mean, literally, people were trying to kill this guy. His life was not easy. But what he did over and over again is he came back to remembering who God is. And if you read through the Psalms, you'll read there's times when he's frustrated. There's times when he's annoyed. There's times where he wishes things were different. And he keeps coming back. In order to have this confidence, he keeps coming back to remembering, oh, I do remember who God is. And that God is with me. I put Psalm 145 up on the screen. It says this. It says, great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love. The Lord is trustworthy in all he promises, faithful in all he does. The Lord upholds all who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. David, over and over again, he has to remind himself. We all have to remind ourselves every day of the promises that God has given us. God says, I love you. God, that's it. I love you. No matter what, I love you. That's what God says. God says, I promise I'll be with you. I'm not going to leave you. I'll be with you. And not only that, God says, I am for you. God wants the best for your life every single day. Every single day, God is actively working for your good. Every day. That's a promise. He doesn't take a day off. He doesn't take vacation. God, every single moment of every single day is actively working for your best interest. How do we wake up every morning with that in our heart? That's what David was doing. You know, what's interesting is it doesn't always change our situation. That God doesn't promise that your life will be easy, but God promises that he will be with you through it all. Right. That's what God promises. That's what was different about David's heart than anyone else's. That's what David said to Goliath. David said, they will know who God is. They will know that this battle was not won with abilities and swords. This one battle was won by God. That was the difference. That's what's in David's heart. That's what God saw even when David was a 10-year-old little kid and why he was anointed to be king, because God saw that that was going to be in his heart. This memory of who God is, this remembering who God is, this understanding who God is. Right? In this passage, in this thing, it says, God is bigger than we can fathom. That's what was in David's heart. God is bigger than we can fathom. I'm going to ask the band to come back up. And while we do that, I want to tell you one more quick story about David. And this one actually happens a few years later because this also gives us an insight into his heart. And how you have a heart that is different than other people, a heart after God. So let's jump ahead many years. David is now the king, okay? David is now the king, and they decide that they want to move this thing that's called the Ark of the Covenant, which is like this big religious symbol. They're going to move it to Jerusalem. And so to do that, they have a whole parade, and it's a bunch of people walking around like in a parade, cheering and being excited and basically worshiping God. So kind of like the music we were doing, it's kind of like that, like ramp it up 100 times, like the concert's going to be that we're going, the CT aptitude, right? Yeah, so it's just like, think about a bunch of people just all excited, worshiping God, a parade of them, and David is the king, and he's leading this. And he is the one leading. He's like jumping around and dancing, all excited, worshiping who God is. And he gets excited. He actually takes off his like king robes. Like he has robes at the time that are like king robes. And he basically says that he went and he danced in front of this group and he was dancing in his underrobes, which is kind of like his underwear, all right? So he gets so excited that he's like dancing and worshiping God in his underwear. Don't worry, we're not going to do that tonight. He gets excited. He's like dancing and worshiping God in his underwear. And he actually has a wife who's not happy with him. And she actually comes up to him and she goes, after this, she goes, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have danced in your underwear because it's not very dignified. It's not what a king would do. And not only that, people aren't going to respect you now because of it. All right, now you got to read here. We're going to read in 2 Samuel now what he says. David said to Micah, his wife, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But the slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. This is basically what he means here, all right? What he means is he goes, hey, I'm going to worship God, and I'm going to like go all out worshiping God, and I'm going to go out, and if I have to get even more undignified to worship God, I will. But these people that you think aren't going to respect me, they're going to respect me even more. Because they're going to see somebody who's so excited about who God is. That's the point about David. He was so excited. He just like worshiped and he didn't care that people saw him in his underwear. Like he was just so excited. So we're going to sing some songs here. I'm going to pray, and then you guys need to stand up and you need to sing and worship this God. You need to worship this God who is with you every moment of every day. This God that's bigger than you could imagine. This God that you can trust every promise of who they are, because when you understand who that God is, when you understand those promises, that's what enables you to have that confidence, that heart that David had. Let me pray. God, we do thank you. We thank you so much that you are a God that is beyond we can imagine. We can't fathom the depths, the greatness, the grandeur, the beauty of who you are. We can't imagine how much you love us, how much you're with us, how much you're actively working on our behalf. And so as we take a little time to worship now, I pray that you'd help us just refocus our minds and our hearts to understand who you are so that we can have that heart that David has, so we can have that confidence and boldness that we have. So just allow us to worship you freely now. In Jesus' name, amen.